Last time I preached this text was a year ago on Earth Sunday. And today we will be shifting gears a little bit as we continue with our little series on Romans chapter 8. When I was growing up, there were no four-letter words allowed near our house. I learned very quickly growing up what words were appropriate and what words weren't appropriate. When I moved to West Michigan, where my first church was, I learned very quickly that there's a whole range of words that weren't used, but they had very clever other words that were used as their four-letter words. And I would also often ask, well, what's the difference if the meaning behind them is the same? And then we moved to New York, and those words just had even different meanings. But the four-letter word that I am thinking about today might not be the four-letter word you're thinking about. Four-letter word I'm thinking about today is a word that I find many people are longing for. Many people have given up on. A four-letter word that is central to who we are because of whose we are. That four-letter word is hope. Hope that tomorrow will be okay. Hope that the future is different than what we might experiencing in the present. I opened the Times this morning on my way here, and what did I see but a war in Ukraine, protests in Israel, things about climate change, medicine expenses going up, politicians in trouble yet not in trouble, and then the Barbie movie, which I was told is not fit for children. And I meet young people who feel like a generation without hope. I have kids that are in that age between childhood and adulthood, although they all can try to convince me they are surely adults. And I listen to them talk, I listen to their friends talk, I see what the media says, and it's a generation almost ready to throw their hands up and be done with it all, thanking my generation for all the wonderful things that we left them. And so as I think about these things, as I look at this text, as we look at a text that is filled with so much, these words of hope. And I really believe right now in our current place in the world, as we look to a future, as we try to figure out life after COVID, yet with COVID, as we look at the church and wonder what is coming, what is next, what will we need to leave behind, I believe that one of the greatest things we as the body of Christ can offer our world and ourselves and one another is hope. Last week, if you remember, I mentioned that in this text, we don't want to get caught up in the idea of the flesh and the spirit. Really what it is pointing to earthly things and things of God. Earthly things and things of God. And here, Paul goes much deeper in that relationship with God. And he talks about adoption. Now, adoption is a wonderful thing when it happens in our day and age between the right fit. And we don't hear much about all the good adoptions that take place. We hear about a lot of the negative ones that do. But adoption back in this time was very different. For adoption was the dying of one person and the rebirth of someone else. This was a society where the father had total control for his entire life. He controlled everything in the house, all the possessions. He controlled and made all of the decisions until the day that he died. It didn't matter how old you were as a child. you were expected by law to follow absolutely everything that the father said. In fact, there was a time in the early days of Greece where a father could have their children, their spouse, any of their slaves or whatnot killed for no reason except that he is the father. And when adoption would happen, it was oftentimes treated as a transaction. And in fact, there were two things that had to happen for the adoption. The first thing is that the father who is adopting the other child would buy that child from the child's biological father 3 times. The first time they would buy the child and the father would buy the child back. The second time they'd buy the child and the child would be bought back. The third time they would buy the child symbolically and the father would walk away. And then the adopting father would go to court and in front of a judge would argue in the courtroom why they should recognize this adoption. And as soon as someone was adopted, everything changed. Any of their debt, any of their problems, even any crimes that they had committed and punishments that were given to them, all of that was wiped away. All of that was wiped away, and they were 100% a part of this family. 100% receiving all of the power and the prestige and the money and all of those things, because poor people were not adopting people, because what would the benefit be? There were even emperors who adopted, and then that child would rise up to emperor. So there's this understanding that as we are adopted as children of God, we earn as heirs equal to Christ. We are looked upon as children of God. No ands, no buts, no really quick, but they're adopted. A child of God, able to receive all the blessings that God gives. And then there's this intimacy that we hear in this text. Abba. Abba, I'm sure you've heard it translated as daddy or this or that in different sermons or conversations. But what it was denoting was an intimacy that in the Hebrew tradition was unheard of. God was God. God was the creator. God was this all-powerful, all-knowing judge that was constantly keeping track of the good and the bad that we were doing and awarding appropriately. Jesus really rocked the boat when Jesus refers to God in this intimate way. Never had anyone thought or even dared enter into a place of blasphemy to think that they might have this intimate relationship with the Creator. An intimacy really beyond imagination. It was unfathomable that this could even be true. So as we enter into this text, we do so having heard words like child of God and Abba and this and that all through our lives and not thinking anything of it, but recognizing that the original reader would read these words and it would give chills down their spine when suddenly this great chasm between them and the Almighty is filled, when all of a sudden there is an opportunity to be in this intimate space. All of a sudden, hope looks a little bit different when we are depending on something so far away, or we are depending on one who is intimate in our lives. It's a lot easier to have a little bit of hope when the person we're hoping on is so close and so dear. I love your baptismal font. I love the richness of it, but more importantly, the placing of it. Because it is in the covenant and in the baptism that we understand what is taking place. It is in this covenant where God has sworn to be your God no matter what. No matter what. And that there is nothing that you can do to earn or lose that love. To earn or lose that grace. A covenant that goes so deep to the 1,000th generation of those who love God. And all of a sudden, we have this understanding that what we're talking about is that God gives us hope. God offers us hope in even the darkest situation. And the question becomes, do you trust God? I mean, we throw that around a lot, don't we? Do you trust God? Do you believe in God? Do you love God? But no, do you really trust God? In the Old Testament, hope, there was either hope or fear. There was no middle ground. Hope or fear. And hope meant there was a good future. But so often that future was tied into our behavior and our relationship with God, keeping that scale balanced between the good things that I do, balancing out the bad that I do. And there was some of that idea of hope or fear in this New Testament understanding of hope, but it switches the responsibility of the hope. No longer does hope rest on me and my behavior, but hope rests on the promise of God to be our God and to love us and to care for us and to meet us with grace in all that we do. Nothing that we could do to earn or lose that grace. Nothing to earn or lose that hope. And so we are invited to trust God and to patiently wait, sometimes for a very, very long time. To actively wait, to not sit back and wonder in our own struggles, but to actively be in that space. To recognize that because God is our God, because God has called us a child, because God is intimate with us through the grace that is Jesus Christ, we suddenly are allowed to hope. In fact, we're suddenly allowed to have hope be central to our life. Could you imagine yourself at your next dinner party and everyone's going on and on about the downfalls of the world and all that's going on and the elections that are coming up and the price of this and the price of that, and suddenly you chime in on the hope that you have for what is to come. Two of my children, my oldest and my youngest, have very, very rare medical conditions. When they were born, we were told they wouldn't live very long. In fact, my son at one point was sent home from the hospital to hospice. And we were trying to figure it out the other day, and we were arguing, has there been 30 surgeries in our family or 40 surgeries in our family, or how many surgeries have these kids actually had? Between my 26-year-old and my 21-year-old. Our family has really figured out how to do trauma well. We don't always do day-to-day well, but we do trauma really well. And hope is central to that trauma. Hope is central to trusting what is next. We had worked so hard, my wife working a lot harder than me, on getting these kids to adulthood. We have never thought about what do we do in adulthood. We never thought about that. And now we're trying to figure that out. But we continue to go back and lean into this hope. I remember it was one of the surgeries my son was having, and I don't remember if we were in Westchester, if we were in Columbia Pres. I guess it's that way. We were in Columbia Pres, but it wasn't going well. And we were not sure if we would be bringing our little boy home. And my wife grabbed my hand and she said to me, no matter what, it's going to be okay. Now, she wasn't being some Pollyanny, oh, everything's going to be great because I love Jesus kind of a thing. She was saying, if he lives or dies, it'll be okay. We will someday again know joy. We will someday again know blessings. We will always have a ripped out heart, as any parent who has lost a child does. But because we have said yes to the covenant and said yes to the baptism and said yes to this grace and have said yes to the hope, we believe that it will be okay. Might not be what we want, might not look as we want it to, but we will know love, we will know joy, we will know peace, we will know grace, and we will know hope. It all begins with believing in hope and not destruction. Believing that love wins. Believing that God does keep promises. It begins with saying yes. It begins with saying it will be okay if you believe it or not. It begins with being courageous enough to live in hope, love, joy, grace, and peace as the world feels like it is burning around us. And then, when we find ourselves in that space, to reach out and grab on to others so they too might know that there is hope. Pray with me, please. Gracious God, we thank you for your promises. I'm not even going to apologize for not always trusting you, because your hope and your love and your grace is not even dependent on that. But help us, Lord, to know your hope. Help us, Lord, to live a life that in both the joys and the sorrows, in the celebrations and the tragedies, we might have your hope. That we might live in a life that is led and influenced by you, not in ignorance, not in foolishness, but in a confidence that you are never going anywhere, and that the intimacy that we share with you as our Creator is with us now and forever. And even when we can't believe it, to recognize that it will be okay. Amen.